Well, thank you everyone for attending. It's lovely to see all of you. My name's Mike. I go online under the handle Nolsky, so you'll find me as Nolsky in the Matrix chat as well as in IRC. I have a bunch of titles because I choose to have titles instead of a social life. But probably the most important in the context of this talk is the bottom one. I am a scholar of political economy, of science and technology. I'm a graduate student, and this is kind of the field that I study. So political economy is kind of a funny word, but essentially what it means is it's the study of how economic systems and political systems are intrinsically linked. And so this framing is really what drives the analysis of my talk today. And so political economy has been around for a very long time. It's been the primary subject of many very, very famous and loved thinkers throughout history that I'm not going to name. But, what are we talking about here today? Well, first, I want to do a quick history of free and open source software, like a very abridged one to kind of drive home a couple of questions I've been asking myself for the last few years. Second, I want to kind of posit a question about, are we really building the same software now that we were when the initial foundations of the ideology around free software began? And if we aren't, how is this software we're building today different? Then I want to talk about kind of where we are today as a community, as a society, and ideologically. And then lastly, I kind of want to posit some questions that will hopefully generate a very lively but hopefully respectful discussion that adheres to the code of conduct with this event. So let's get started. Or actually, let's not get started because I talked to my boss and I have to give a couple disclaimers. So first, I'm going to be talking about politics here and economics of free software. And I want to be clear, this talk, it doesn't seek to analyze or make any stance on the morality of who you work for or whether your employer makes you a good person or a bad person. It doesn't even seek to analyze whether certain organizations are good or bad. This talk is to analyze the structures that exist in our technological production and see whether we might be interested in changing those structures, not who is good and bad. Furthermore, I got to read this verbatim according to my boss. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities that I represent. So now that that's out of the way. Thank you. Yes. So hopefully I will have a job when I get back home. So let's do a quick timeline of free and open source software. This is very abridged, so I'm leaving out parts for brevity so we can have a discussion and focus on other things. But in general, for this talk, I want to bisect the history of FOSS into two periods, right? And these dates are very generalized, but the first period I would argue is between the 70s and the early noughts, right? Particularly during the beginning of this period, computing hardware was just starting to become standardized, right? Previously, if you bought a computing machine, it would come with a software provided by the manufacturer, and it was custom made for that model, right? And you couldn't easily transfer software from one model by one manufacturer into another. But soon after, hardware architectures became standardized, right? And so people could write software that runs on many different kinds of machines. They could share it with each other, they could trade it, and software became what's called a commodity, right? And so this generated all sorts of new industries that I'm sure you're all aware of within information technology and so on. And as part of this, businesses formed to develop and sell software and services around that software. And at the same time, so too did communities of practice, of production, that sort of formed the early ideas of what we imagine as open source or free software communities. And so from this situation arose the beginnings of what I would call one of the foundational ideological pillars of free and open source software. In particular, Richard Stallman proposed these 4 essential rights or freedoms for users as like this, kind of core ideological pillar of what free software should allow and kind of be about, right? These aren't like licensing terms, but rather kind of a stance, right, ideologically. Specifically, right, it's for any software a user, obtains, they should be able to use it for whatever purpose they want. They should be able to understand how it works. They should be able to share it onward to whoever they think might want it. And they should be able to modify it to suit their own needs, right, and improve it potentially. And so, one thing I'm really interested in considering during this period is the underlying assumptions in technological context during when these 4 freedoms were initially posited, right? At this time, most software was this very discrete thing that oftentimes came in a box or on a floppy disk or whatever, right? And when you ran it, it was on your own machine. It was limited in its size and complexity. It was portable and understandable largely, right? And it was discrete. So, many businesses at the time would license their software in this way that explicitly forbade these rights, right? Like when you can download my copy of Windows, but you have to pay for it and you can't modify it and you can't do whatever. And so this causes tension between these communities of developers creating free and open source software and businesses who were specifically seeking to profit off of their ability to generate revenue through these proprietary licensing strategies. Bill Gates, had this infamous quote where he referred to free software activists as, at the time, as communists on a television interview. And I would argue if you talk to folks from this period, many free software organizations actually struggled with being labeled as communists or anarchists at the time. And so this was kind of almost like a meme. And just as a disclaimer here before I get sued. This poster wasn't made by Microsoft, so this poster was a meme created by someone else. So this is not representing Microsoft's views at the time or now. So Microsoft, please do not sue me for false light. So anyways, this struggle led to there being many projects and products, both open source and proprietary, right? Oftentimes competing products, right? And many businesses offered their own solutions that actively marketed against open source software alternatives that were trying to accomplish the same goals, fulfill the same features as their proprietary counterparts, right? And these businesses, a lot of their ideas at the time is they were relying on their greater cohesion to try to build a better product and software ecosystem to when compared to their sometimes fragmented open source alternative. And this is how they seek to try to capture the market for any given use case, right? So in short, we had this situation where we see directly competing products whose common differentiator is really their licensing strategy. This is the thing that made them stand out apart from each other, right? You got Windows and Linux, you got Firefox and Internet Explorer, you got OpenGL and DirectX, right? All these were competing products to see which was better. In all these cases, there was a competition between which organization, the community or the firm, could build what capacities more effectively, right? And many of our debates and discussion at the time revolved around which method of production was more efficient at building these capacities. And I'm sure even if you go around today or you talk to your friends, we still hear these discussions, right? When we're talking about trying to encourage people to develop open source. It's more effective, it's just easier, we can share costs. And so, during this time, licensing was this huge part, if not the most important part, of when we thought about the battle between free and open source software and proprietary software ecosystems. IP rights at the time were really coming to a fore with the advent of a lot of digital intellectual property. And when considering this initial ideology focused on user autonomy, freedom, and freedom, this idea of IP ownership in order to facilitate that through licensing was the sort of core method that many people thought about how to achieve this sort of more ideological goal, right? So now I want to kind of jump ahead to this sort of second phase where we are today, right? So this relationship between open source and proprietary software, it didn't really stay this way, right? Now, as we all know, as you come to any one of these conferences, you've probably seen this statistic already today. Free and open source software has become this foundational infrastructure upon which pretty much all of our digital services are built, right? And before I go ahead, I just want to drop a thank you and a note that a lot of the graphs I'm going to be showing in the next couple slides come from this amazing 2021 report written by the Digital Commons Policy Council. So I got a link to that Policy Council in the slides, which you can download off of the FOSDEM website. I encourage you to check it out, but they did a lot of really great work for getting the data and the empirical sort of findings here. So anyways, today we see some of the biggest antagonists towards free and open source software actually directing the most significant amounts of their workforce towards its support and budget, especially when compared to other firms, right? Microsoft was the big bad in open source, right? And now they're actually one of the largest contributors of it, right? They're very much bought into open source software production. Not only have major firms changed their tune in relationship to each other, but now when we look at open source communities and the largest projects and most important projects on the internet, employees of these firms now generally outnumber independent contributors. I'm careful to use the term independent here rather than volunteer because independent contributors are oftentimes contributing in the context of an organization or institution, but it's not really one that is focused specifically on maximizing profit for themselves. So these types of contributors, I would argue, face very different incentives in terms of what they're trying to build and for what purpose. Furthermore, as time has gone on, the ratio of firm employees to the independent contributor has increased steadily, right? So year over year, in pretty much all major projects, the amount of firm employees when compared to non-firm employees has increased, right? So this is not just a finding, but it's a year over year trend that's increasing steadily. So, I would argue one thing to note in this case then is that we can sort of find that independent contributors oftentimes have less power in these communities simply because they're being outnumbered by a much more cohesive group of other contributors, and they just have less power to develop, right? And so, while these projects are majorly developed at the explicit discretion of firms, what I think is most important is actually the shift between these two periods is actually how the form of software itself has shifted when thinking about open source software. So if you look at this list of projects, so this was, I think, the top 20 or 25 projects that in terms of contributors and activity founded by the Digital Commons Policy Council. And if you look at this list, nearly all of these projects, they aren't really end user software anymore, even of the technical sort, right? Many are for use solely in the development of these sort of large-scale products and platforms that can really only be applicable to users who have significant resources to run them, right? So let's have a look, right? We got a number of server orchestration software such as Kubernetes, Moby, or Ansible. We also have machine learning and distributed systems projects such as Spark, PyTorch, and TensorFlow. I'm sure as you attend talks today, even at FOSDEM, a conference that's quite community focused, you'll likely find the majority of software programs being discussed are of this type. So why has the production of free and open source software shifted so incredibly to this one very kind of specific niche within software applications? So I'd like to argue that most of the software we interact with on a day-to-day basis, and maybe I'm leaning out of the free software developer archetype here when I'm saying this, but most of the software we interact with aren't really discrete applications anymore, but rather what I would call platforms, right? And because of this, the relationship of much of our open source software and our proprietary software has like fundamentally changed, right? So why are these projects that are important now so different than the projects that were important before? I'd like to argue that many of the most powerful technology firms have largely pivoted away from licensing discrete software products as their core sort of revenue model to the development and managing of platforms to generate revenue for them. So, before we go forward, I'm sure you've all heard the term platform before, but I'd like to try to formally define it in economic terms, right? And so this sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, but this definition was first posited by Nobel Prize-winning economist Lerner and Tirole. So platforms, when we think about a platform, you oftentimes think about it like a software system or something like that, right? But these software systems aren't really commodities in themselves, but rather they're made as a system to manage access between like networks on two sides of a wall or like commodities on two sides of a wall. So to give an example of this, Facebook is a platform which manages access to communities and media for end users on one side, and then willing eyes, data, and ad positioning for advertisers on the other side. And Facebook has kind of this monopolized access to both of these networks, right? Or at least like a very preferential access to both. Amazon is a platform which facilitates access to distribution networks and a global marketplace for producers on one side, and then a network of goods and services for consumers on the other side. Google is a platform which facilitates information and digital services for end users on one side, and again, willing eyes and user networks for those digital service providers and advertisers on the other. So the nature of the platform has positioned their creators to exploit what are called these multi-sided markets with these sort of two networks by acting as a mediator and a gatekeeper between access across this sort of divide. So, I'd like to posit this question to everyone that we always hear all the time. It's honestly probably getting a little old in the tooth, but has open source won? Like, have we done it? We are foundational to the operation of like the entire world. Open source is really important. More people than ever are creating it, right? And so, no, I don't think so. I mean, there's clearly more open source, right? There's probably a similar or larger proportion of open source software to proprietary software that we use on a daily basis, at least within the dependency chain. However, we still have little to no control over the vast majority of services that impact most people's lives, particularly digital services, right? From e-commerce to social media to healthcare provision, all of these, might heavily rely on free and open source infrastructure to function, but we still have no actual control. So when we think about the ideological pillars of our movement in the first place, I don't see any significant gains in this area. So, to me, when looking at this history, it really seemed that many free and open source advocacy programs have been outmaneuvered in this way due to the shape of our software changing. So, I know that's like a little depressing and everything, and I'm sure many people have a lot of opinions about maybe the validity of that, but I kind of want to talk about, well, if this is the case, right, and if this is a problem that we as a community are facing, then what do we do about it, right? So first, I want to kind of review a couple of key points that I wanted to make, and then I know this is like a stage talk, but I want to have a lot of Q&A afterwards to have a discussion with the audience. So first and foremost, I want to claim, free and open source software isn't competing with proprietary software anymore in any significant way. I know there's, probably examples, but when we look at the largest, most active, most important free and open source software projects, they are not competing with proprietary alternatives. They're helping host them, right? The second is our labor as free and open source software contributors in general is being increasingly dictated by firms. We see this year on year because we're being continually outnumbered by firm contributors, and we're having less of a say in the communities that we act in. Furthermore, more of us are working directly for firms when contributing and are therefore, required to represent their interests. And even when we aren't, certainly the most important projects, our ability to dictate the direction of these is, we're outnumbered. On the flip side, we are finding when these firms suffer any loss in their rate of profit, usually it is us who are among the first to be cut, right? This precarity and increasing control that firms have over our collective labor powers means that oftentimes we're losing autonomy as creators over our own labor. So this original framing of user control over, our software that we download and run on our machines, I would argue is no longer relevant because we live in a time where, we majorly interact with these really complex, massive platforms. Most critical software we interact with is no longer these discrete packages offering specific functionality to users, but rather, these platforms are gating and mediating access between markets, commodities, and other networks, right? Therefore, our original conception of simply increasing the amount of openly licensed software products is no longer as relevant as the projects we're building are largely infrastructure to maintain these platforms, right? So we can no longer avoid this very political question about how we attempt to reorganize free and open source software labor on behalf of these original ideals of, user rights. Labor organization has frequently been a topic avoided previously in free and open source software, and I would argue it was due to this major focus on licensing instead. We didn't talk about who we're working for or how we're organizing our work because we wanted to focus on where the ownership was. And if we can create more, open licensed things, then the ownership goes to everyone and then the power is distributed. And I would argue we've seen that we've been kind of outmaneuvered in that sense because our interaction with owned software has largely changed. So, this all sounds not great, but if this is the case, then how can we adopt a more sort of labor-oriented approach to the topic of free and open source values and ideals, right? How can you, as a FOSSer, or me, I'm not off the hook here, help bring about this change? So, I can't claim to have all of the answers here. I'm just a guy interested in this topic, studying this stuff. Especially now, I understand the topic of political change is a very touchy one. However, there are some ideas that I've researched that I think would be, at least worthwhile for us as a community to investigate further. The first is the idea of understanding that not all free and open source software contributions are equal. So when considering the value of free and open source software contributions, maybe we should prioritize developing alternatives to existing platforms that are controlled by firms, right? And so when I say alternative here, I don't just mean an openly licensed clone, but rather a solution designed specifically with these ideals of user autonomy in mind, right? It may take an entirely different form to create something that would be comparable. The second I want to talk about that I think is very important is organizing within the workplace. I've met many burnt out free and open source software maintainers in my life, and I understand the pain there. And so, our ability to produce what we want requires that we have greater control over our own labor. So, while technology roles, are oftentimes compensated well, at least, within certain geographic areas, it doesn't eliminate our precarity as workers, right? And I think in particular, many of us are finding that out now. So, in this case, what do we do about it? Well, historically, the formulation of labor unions have allowed us as workers to better bargain with our employees and regain control over our labor power. And I think, when thinking about how we can manage to have the time and capacity to be able to build what we want, thinking about regaining that control within your own workplace, particularly through labor unions, is a great first step. The third thing I want to talk about, which is a little touchy, is explicit political organizing within the context of our free and open source software community. I don't think we can just build and license the solutions that we want, but rather we need to organize ourselves along explicit political lines that go beyond that of licensing. When you think about free and open source software, I was in Bradley Kuhn's talk today in the legal dev room, where it was kind of talking about his personal history in this case, and he talked about how there were a lot of, I forget the word he used, but like collaborations between groups that had different interests, right? And he was questioning, he's like, I don't know if we should have worked with them or worked with someone else. And I think it's very hard to determine these sort of partnerships that you enter unless you have a very clear political line that you as a community are agreeing to work together on. And I think defining this is really important, probably just as important as something like the open source definition. Lastly, I think finding and developing new workplaces is going to be a really important fact when thinking about, kind of figuring out how we can organize ourselves to develop the software that we want, right? I get that this isn't an option for everyone immediately, but, the role of institutions such as, NGOs, nonprofits, and universities have historically been, key creators of foundational free and open source software infrastructures. And furthermore, I think we as a community see our ability to represent ourselves lessening in general, right? You look at organizations like the Linux Foundation, and they pretty much exclusively represent the interests of their corporate members. That is literally how they're incorporated, right? And they have no public good mandate. So I would argue that we should organize, agitate, and push for these institutions in our society to support this production to draw power away from firms. So now this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. I'm not claiming you should all be communists, but this is my poorly made rendition of the earlier poster. I want to wrap up with free and open source software. I would argue was largely outmaneuvered due to this lack of cohesion and organization within a specified political framework. And so if we do seek to reorganize ourselves for a new era in free and open source software, then we should consider how we got here and see if we can correct some of those mistakes. So this is my second to last slide, and I'd like to open it up for Q&A if that's okay. But I thought I would leave this here. If you found this stuff interesting, I like to leave kind of further reading lists. And so these were some of the primary citations that drove this research for me, but also I think just were interesting, relevant sort of pieces of written work. There's a couple books in here. I linked to them on LibGen if you can't afford them. You should be able to download the ebook at least. And yeah, thank you. I'm Mike, and I'd like to hopefully try and answer any and all questions you might have.
Thank you very much for the talk. You presented a very interesting table regarding the leading firms for each repositories, etc. So I'm an XPKG contributor, and it was mentioned that the leading firm was Logic Blocks. I think it doesn't exist anymore. So I'm very interested in understanding how you generate such tables, because it's super interesting. Also, how do you deal with corporations or firms which are not really firms? So for example, on the table there was a Home Assistant, and the leading firm was Affolter Engineering, which to the best of my knowledge is 2%, which I don't know if you qualify this as a firm or not. And what about those like repository or projects where you have a lot of people which comes from very different backgrounds? Yes, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so as I understand it, there was a little bit of rattling. You're kind of asking, so like what was the methodology for generating the data that you're showing? How'd you get it? So am I able to click on this? Which one is it? So these tables were generated by the Digital Commons Policy Council as part of a Ford Foundation Digital Critical Infrastructure Research Grant. I don't know if oh wow, that is small. So this is the research grant. I don't have Wi-Fi. That was silly of me. But essentially, they detail in this report their exact methodology for doing it. It was a lot of like had to deduplicate identities. We compared emails and for like frequency, commits, and sort of mangled it all together into a single report. But they can detail it pretty well. I did look over it because I was asking myself the same questions, and I was pretty satisfied with it. It was a while ago, so I probably would do a poor job of repeating it.
I'm over here. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. I found that really interesting and very provoking. An outcome I see, a conclusion of this, the idea that free software has become platformized and has become this sort of substrate is a sort of two-tier society where, like, we in this room are a sort of intelligentsia and we have access to these free tools and we get access to the four freedoms. We can use like free software licensed products, and we can study them, share them, and improve them. And then we build services as a software substitute, and everybody else is a kind of lumpen proletariat who doesn't get those freedoms and doesn't get to sort of benefit in the intellectual fruits of free software. Is that necessarily connected to the kind of corporate capture of free and open source software that you were talking about? And what are the organizational routes or the agitations that we can take to actually extend those freedoms out beyond the experts and to the people who use computers?
Yeah, so a very big question you asked for sure. If we imagine the free software community, oftentimes we're very technical people, right? Like if you like, I use Linux desktop, and I'm like a pretty I'm a social scientist, so I would consider myself probably fairly non-technical here. But it allows us to like have these sort of freedoms by having this technical knowledge. And many people, I'm sure many of you have interacted with, maybe don't have that technical knowledge or that capacity or whatever to sort of interact with free software in the same way and use it. Maybe their job requires that they don't or whatever. And so, does this play a part in sort of figuring out how we can advocate for these ideas to be more equitable across people? Is that correct? Cool. So, I would argue that for sure, as technologists, we face unique labor pressures, right? In particular, like I was at the EU policy forum thing yesterday, and there are like a lot of policy people that go up, and they're like, technology, the coders are going to save the planet because they're genius, and they kind of, we get a lot of lip service towards our technical ability. But on the flip side, I would argue that we still face many of the same precarities that people have, that we've seen workers have throughout history. And for sure, it's a struggle, and it's a discussion we need to have, as we're organizing ourselves. But I think first and foremost, if we want to have better free and open source software, we got to have more, control over our own labor power to create it. We've done a lot of really cool stuff, just like as hobbyists and things like that. But imagine if there was like an army of us all working together and dictating this is what we want. I don't want Facebook. Who likes Facebook anyways, right? I want to build the thing that's actually allowing me to connect with people in the ways that I dictate is best for me. It takes a lot of organization and agitation to get there. And I think even as intellectuals or a person in the professional managerial class, we still have a lot of incentive to work at that. I hope that answers it. It's kind of a vague answer.
Yeah, so when open source was being developed in discrete ways for discrete products, there was no cost to the developers of the software when someone used that software in whatever setting. So you could produce 1,000 or 1,000,000, and the open source project almost didn't know who was there and who was using it. And I understand your concept that there's more of a consumption at the platform level now than discrete software. But the question is, how do projects evolve in an environment where you have to provide there is now a cost to that platform. So you've got to have infrastructure, you've got to have networking, you've got to have admins and so forth. And there's now a per user cost in a lot of ways to how your software is consumed in a way that before it was zero cost. And it feels like that change is pretty significant and does almost open the door or close the door, frankly, for pure open source projects to almost operate at scale in that environment.
Yeah, great question. And very, very relevant and not one I think I have the answer to, but like I want to maybe propose a couple of potential answers that I think, I can't choose, right? We have to choose. And so, when thinking about platforms, there's a lot of different ways. Currently many platforms are kind of exploitative, right? Like we don't really have a choice in terms of whether or not we use them if we want to have access to a certain thing, like social networks or whatever. So part of it's like, oh, maybe we just need to collectively own it, right? Maybe like just nationalize it, right? Is like one very political way of thinking about solving this problem, right? If we nationalize it, then it's like democratically controlled, theoretically. And like this is one way of approaching this problem of user autonomy. Then if someone wants to change it, then we have like democracy to help facilitate that somehow. Another way of approaching the problem though is like, do we need platforms at all, right? Is this approach of one specific technological solution to solving one specific, need within our society, is this the right way of going about it, or was this just like the most effective way of running it? Can we imagine futures of which like our technology is progressing, but it's still discrete enough that we can maintain control over it? And then what does that look like, and how do we get there? I think these are, the kind of the different sort of arguments and kind of maybe factions that might arise within the open source community. I think if we begin really rethinking like what we're doing on a more fundamental level. Does that sort of, yeah, thanks. Hi.
I was wondering what would we see or hear when there's good organization within the workplace? And that question is sort of in context of major strikes in the UK at the moment around a lot of public services, and also in context of a blog post by Carl Mitchell called "It's a Trap," which is basically warning that the union sphere in the US is very heavily legislated, and there's lots of sort of bad political context when it comes to saying we should have a union for this, basically being something that you shouldn't ask for unless you really know what you're getting into.
Yeah. So I guess maybe before you hand it off, is your question more on like, what do we do about unions kind of being portrayed in a certain way, or is it like as a union applicable?
Organize well, right? You want us to organize? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a lot of friends, and as part of my research, I do lots of research with how unions currently organize and how they use technology. And so, there's not one, everyone I talk to, whenever I ask them this question, they're like, well, I can't give you a blueprint, right? But I can tell you some things that work for us, right? Within, I work with a couple union organizers at Amazon, right? And they have huge turnover. So, focusing on new employees as a point of organizing and getting people and educating them is very important for them. However, I have another friend that works as a technician in a hospital who has a very small department. And when they started focusing on unionizing, or at least collectively bargaining amongst themselves, they started in a very small but critical part of their organization saying, we can't do the whole hospital at once. We'll just get fired, right? Or we'll have a bad time, and it'll be very hard, and we don't have the capacity. But maybe within our department, if we begin forming certain lines about what we want and like what we care about, we can begin starting our organization from there and then moving outward if we gain momentum. I think particularly within the technological context and people within, like sort of tech companies, this might be an interesting thing to try out. But that said, we haven't seen, we don't have a lot to learn from in this sense, right? There aren't a lot of existing tech company unions, but like, maybe that's a place to start, maybe looking at some of the smaller ones. Or, if you work at Amazon, check out Amazon Workers United. If you're at Google, check out Alphabet Workers United. There are existing unions within these companies, even if they aren't contract unions.
Thanks for your talk. And this is also related to like organization. You mentioned software foundations. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of them have similar structures and like business models. So, because I've been thinking about like alternatives to software foundation. Is it that we need to work on like a different membership or a different business model or governance? I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I
it's a big question, and certainly one I hear a lot of folks talking about. I think it's I would argue, and I know I called out many companies here, but I would argue the Linux Foundation is quite different from most open source software foundations. Linux Foundation is a membership organization that is formed specifically to represent its corporate members. You pay for a membership to get into the Linux Foundation. They have a summit and stuff like that, and they're supposed to advocate on your right, on behalf of your interests as a tech company that utilizes open source, and they've grown quite a lot due to their funding. But I would argue that's like very different from something like the Python Software Foundation or the Rust Foundation or even like Apache or something like that. I would argue I would like to see more collaboration. I don't think software foundations for every project that exists in their own little ecosystem. I think that's good, so you can receive funding and stuff like that. But we should start figuring out ways that like, what if there was a Linux Foundation that wasn't, driven principally by like members who paid for ownership, right? Maybe we could think about things like, the top contributors might get membership if you contribute a certain amount, or some other form. There's a lot of different ways that you could go about it, but I think like figuring out how to bring communities together with similar interests, even if they aren't the same project or in the same tech stack, is important, because then you can begin organizing along ideological lines rather than just like, how do we make Wayland work better in GNOME or something?
I feel like there are a lot of pieces to kind of dismantling these platforms, and I feel like a few of them are being discussed around here, like the cooperative company structures and building new like open platforms. But when it comes to unionizing, because there aren't really many tech unions, I've been thinking about a lot about how these would work, and I wondered what your thoughts were on the idea of kind of using tech unions to try and dismantle some of the existing platforms, like say we're not going to work on AWS because we don't agree with Amazon and what it's doing with its other employees, for example. What are your thoughts on that way of approaching this kind of thing?
Yeah, there's, I would say like, one step at a time. Before giving the talk, I talked about this subject to a lot of people, and there's a sense of like, things are pretty bad now. Like, how are we supposed to like deal with all this stuff? It feels like everything's collapsing. We're kind of in survival mode. I would argue, at least right now, right at this moment, the real benefit of unionizing within technology workplaces is it gives a little bit more time and autonomy and stability back to technology workers. And so, when I think about the crisis in open source around like volunteers who are just overburdened and stuff, and I think about like everyone I know that works in tech that's like on call all the time, and like software services are crashing, and now like their coworkers are being laid off, or maybe they are. This is the problem that I think like if we can claw back some of our own time, if we can get a little more autonomy on our own, a little more reasonable working conditions, like even I get that the pay is good in some conditions, then we can begin just having the headspace to think about these new solutions and have the time to organize with each other where like our boss isn't watching us either, right?
Thanks for your talk. You talked about software, but do you think we can observe the same shift from individual and independent contributors to software companies and big firms paid contributors in the international standardization organization like IETF, for example? I think about how the first version of HTTP protocol was defined, and the third version, which was mostly the result of a bargain between Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Is there any data or work on it?
I'm sure there is. I don't have any. I have anecdotal data. Like I served on a couple IEEE standards committees, and noticed this sort of major differentiating where you get people who are there on developing a standard specifically for the interest of their company, right? They're like, oh, my boss is like paying me, and I'm supposed to help manage this and like make it so our organization can accomplish the goals that we want to do. And like I'm not saying it's evil to want to do that or anything like that, but I see a lot of that, and I don't see a lot of people where it's like, I think this standard's pretty cool. Like I did a thing with something related one time, and I want to, it's like showing up at your town hall meeting. Who has time for that anymore, right? So, I would argue the same principles are at play here, right? More and more organizations are interested in like forming standards with each other because it helps share the cost of development of a lot of their infrastructures, right? No one wants to reinvent the entire stack for whatever thing they're building. So by utilizing standards, you can more effectively do that the same way that you could by utilizing open source software to do that. And so I would say like principally there are a lot of similarities, but I don't have like at least at this time, I couldn't empirically prove it. But a great point for further research onward from here.
Right, is that better? Fascinating talk. I just wonder whether we've made life easy for the big corporations. I think we all enjoy writing software. We enjoy solving a problem. It's a bit like an academic researching something, and then you get an entrepreneur making his fortune. How can we fight back as developers?
Yeah. So I guess your question is, if I understand correctly, you're kind of like, we kind of made it easy for us to get into the situation that we are in now. Like, how do we fight back? Is that it? Yeah. Well, I think, I'm not a huge fan of like kind of the self-flagellation where it's like, we got corrupted or whatever. As the last 50 years of history around, the development of digital technology has a lot of very major incentives. It was very complex. It was not necessarily super obvious that we would be where we are today. I think the most important thing is like, the future is yours if you fight for it, right? It's not like an easy, the things I suggested, if you want to try to unionize your workplace, it's not an easy thing to do, I have many people that have like tried and failed, and I know many people that have succeeded as well. But, I think like if if this is something you want, right? If you think about like the 4 freedoms or these ideals of open source as like user autonomy, and you're like, this is the world I want to live in, and as a technologist, I can create this stuff, then, like anything, it'll take work to try to do that. And it's more about recognizing that and then figuring out what to do next. I think we're at time, too.
One more question. Thanks for this. It's really kind of a great thing. I want to ask not only you, but everyone else here, do you think that we as humans can step away from that kind of, that you always need to have someone like in charge? So we have that, pyramidal kind of thing, and that to go more, flat. So that's what I'm saying. So we are so used to have someone in charge and to someone, as you said, word that I don't like a lot, like a dictate to someone and dictate what you should do and actually team up. I'm not sure that we as humans really can do that on some bigger scale. And it's a left. I'm very left, but I don't go far left. So I am on the real left side. So I'm saying that it's kind of feels like if you play in a small band and you make nice songs and music, and as soon as you get the money there, you sell your soul and you're gone. So how we can go more flat without losing our soul?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, it's the human nature needing someone in charge. This is a little bit of a joke here, but I would love to introduce you to my 4-year-old nephew. He might have you changing your thoughts on that very quickly with respecting authority and wanting that. I think there's no easy question about but you have to think about our organization scientifically, right? I don't think it's like a matter of preference, but we have to think about our relationships to each other. We have to test and evaluate various modes of organization, and we have to approach it like any other difficult scientific problem in our lifetime. And through that, hopefully we can find a better solution, if not the right one. Thank you.
Mike, many thanks for the amazing talk.
Thanks.